You know, when I walked out to the 2016 Kia Optima for the first time, I thought to myself, is this last year's car? Because this is all new, but to the untrained eye, it's really going to be hard to tell. And really, that's the whole thing about the Optima. This is Kia's best-selling car. And they knew this, and they weren't just going to go change it completely around for the sake of it when they knew what they had worked. Of course, the owners of the previous generation Optima are going to be able to pick and point out all the little different features about this, but overall this is a more refined, smoother looking, and the most noticeable thing about it is it looks wider. The previous generation and this generation is how the back always comes together. These lines, the way that the roof line rakes into this window and this whole rear quarter. Now Kia wants this to appeal to people that are looking for more of a luxury or a premium mid-size car. And this is one of the best elements about the Optima is it just has this feeling of, well, more luxury, more high quality, let's just put it that way, for a lower cost. And that's the big formula that works here for them. One of the best things about the Optima is just subtlety, restraint. This deck lid spoiler, it just kind of brings out the rear end without screaming, hey, look at me. They don't overuse too many different elements. You don't see the overuse of chrome or matte chrome. It just has this good balance. The black roof contrasting with the white paint color. This is one of the better white cars I've seen on the road. It just, you can tell they spent a lot of time in the styling department here. We're here with the Kia Optima, Scott. What do we know about it?
It's the official car of the NBA.
We're in the shop without Turbowski, and unfortunately, he's had a dramatic event in his life and he can't be a part of this. He does have a couple things that he would like to say about it, and that is he likes the red painted calipers. That's one of his favorite features. He also loves a 4-cylinder engine very much. So those are the two things he'd like to relate. But as we look at this vehicle, it looks eerily familiar to the Hyundai Sonata we had in here because it essentially is the same chassis. Now, with that said, there are some key differences. This has a strut-based front suspension, much like the Sonata, but the big difference here is this is one of Kia's first generations of cars that came from their technical center off the Nürburgring. So Kia and Hyundai dumped hundreds of millions of dollars into this facility where do they not only outsource experts and engineers to help them tune the chassis and suspension, this is why their newer cars have gotten so much better in terms of handling and ride quality. And this Kia spent a lot of time there in development for over almost 2 years. So your suspension settings, your dampers, your brakes, the chassis rigidity is higher on this vehicle than it is on the Sonata. And it's readily apparent the minute you get behind the wheel. This feels much more buttoned down, much more direct. And underneath you couldn't tell, but it's the finer details that really matter. When we come to the back, you can tell that they've used plenty of panels under here to smooth out airflow underneath. It's the kind of this cardboard composite material that runs along both sides. When you get to the back, you can tell the control arms are coated with materials to kind of help airflow over them as well. You do have camber and toe adjustment back here, well, camber adjustment more importantly, so that is a nice touch. Overall, this is a pretty compact rear suspension, but again, you're getting a little bit bigger brakes here, and you're getting this dual spout exhaust, which, you know, can be argued, is that completely necessary, but it is what it is. This is the same 2-liter turbo that Hyundai and Kia share. Now, the big complaint about this motor in both those cars is, one, they've substantially reduced the power output. They've dropped it almost 30 horsepower from the previous generation. It is the same motor, it's just completely retuned different, and they're using a different turbo. And this twin scroll turbo spools up extremely fast, and that's how you get all this torque right off the bat, and you have this instant surge of power all the time. And this is because most people that are driving on the street aren't winding the piss out of the motor at every turn. So if you're just doing normal driving, you're gonna really appreciate this. But if you like the higher revving, the power that's gonna be at the peak RPM, this might disappoint you a little bit. Overall, it's a pretty cleanly laid out engine bay. There aren't any tuning options for this motor, which might turn off some enthusiasts. We don't have a manual transmission. We have a 6-speed automatic, which is not particularly fast to respond to manual shifts, but it is what it is. For a mainstream car, this is still a pretty damn good package considering what else is out there. When I got into this car, my first impressions upon driving it were, this is extremely solid feeling. It has this fitted cabin, yet comfortable. It doesn't feel like you're suffocated, but I felt a really good sense of control with the way everything is laid out in here. Again, it's just the sense of solidity, the confidence in the steering feel, and just overall sportiness of the chassis and the way that everything's dampened. It's one of the better mid-sized cars I've been into that kind of tie all of those formulas together. Now let's take a look at the handling of this thing. We're going to turn off traction and stability control, and we're going to put this in sport mode and manual mode, so I can use the paddles now. Go down in a second. A lot of understeer, a lot of push, a lot of torque steer. In sport mode, unlike a lot of cars that have a sport mode, there's some very visceral changes that happen to this car. The first thing you notice is the throttle response is immediate. It sets the transmission right at that point where that turbo's on boil, and as soon as you breathe on the gas, you feel this sense of acceleration. But the negative part is, even when you're in manual mode, the transmission just does whatever it wants. It won't hold revs for you to a certain point, and it auto upshifts, so that's kind of a downer. Now this is one of those eco-tuned cars, right? It's taking away a little bit of your high-end power and giving you all the usable torque in the mid-range and low RPM range. And you feel it in this car, and more so in this Optima. I don't know if they changed the tuning for this 2-liter here, but in sport mode, it is really fun to drive. That flat bottom steering wheel really helps. The strange thing about driving this car around is you realize how much more you want to push it. You feel like there's a lot of overhead, especially driving on the street here. But when you get to that ragged edge, that's where all its faults come out. I think what this car needs, especially in the front end, is a lot more camber and probably a limited slip. Because when that turbo comes on, you're almost always doing a one-wheel peel, or what sounds like a one-wheel peel, and you're always breaking the tires loose. In fact, I can come to a dead stop in this car and just get tire squeal every time I take off. That's how much torque is there. And I think a lot of it has to do with these crummy all-season tires, too. I mean, that's what I'm talking about. There's so much torque that it is just essentially peeling these tires off. I really like it from a driving perspective for the street, but it tends to get a little bit annoying because you can't ever put the power down in here. Part of it is tuning, part of it is tires, and just part of it is just front wheel drive, honestly. It's almost too much power for this car. Let's take a look at the next batch of turns here. Trans is slow to downshift, unfortunately. Wants to wash out a lot. That's just front wheel drive. Brakes are really good. and that turbo just pulls you out of every scenario. When you're in sport mode, you never have this sense of like you're waiting for the turbo to come on. It's always there. It's really fun to drive, and I can't believe this is just a mainstream mid-sized car. It's that good. Now, I said torque steer earlier, and what I meant was when you're accelerating and turning, there's a lot of pulling on the wheel. But in a straight line, it's virtually non-existent, even with all the torque here. As much as I think this is one of the best mid-sized cars in this segment, this would be the car to look at first, in my opinion. There are some downfalls here. And the limitation is just really front-wheel drive. Again, this reminds me of my experience in the Veloster, right? Because you can drive the pants off of it up until you get to that 90% point, and then everything kind of falls apart. At the limit, this car becomes just sloppy. The other thing to note is when you have the traction stability control off, or it says it's off, it's not really completely all the way off. You can feel the car pulling timing or just cutting power when you're accelerating sometimes, and there's a little bit of slip. Now, yeah, you can peel the tires, and you can even peel the tires with the traction control on. It's just something to note. Now, in terms of overall ride quality, I'm going to put this back in normal mode and take it out of manual mode here. The transmission, when you're in a normal mode, it drops the revs down. It doesn't put you in that immediate throttle response territory where that turbo is right there and ready to go. So driving along normally, this is an extremely quiet cabin. It's refined, it's solid, it feels like a luxury car. I'm not, usually I say, well, it kind of feels like a luxury car. This really does. And over at most all pavement types, it's so well dampened. You don't feel this sense of, well, like this. You don't feel the whole car shake around you. You don't feel a judder through the chassis and into your seat. The other thing is, just because this car's well dampened doesn't mean that you lose the sporty characteristics of it. And you still maintain this element of control and solidity through the steering feel. Now, yeah, sport mode synthetically increases the weight of the steering, but I wouldn't say that it's a horribly bad thing here. When I entered the Optima for the first time, I got this really strong sense of solidity from the way that the doors close, the trunk closes. It feels very well put together. The next thing I look at with an interior is just the type of materials they use and how well they distribute it throughout the cabin. In the case of Kia, I've noticed this lately in the newer models, is they use this really overly textured, soft/hard touch plastics on the upper dash and the upper part of the doors. Now, at first glance, it seems to be very high quality, but once you get to touching it and feeling it and interacting with it, it just feels more kind of industrial type plastic. And this kind of faux-ish stitching that they put along the dash, it really doesn't do it for me. Most people probably aren't going to notice different plastic textures, but the other elements in here are very diverse. There's a good use of different materials here, and Kia's gotten pretty damn good at doing this two-toned interior. In the case of this car, you have this reddish maroon leather surface on the doors, the seating surfaces, and the center armrest. Now, whether you like two-tone interiors or not, there's something interesting here. It does break up the monotony of a black interior pretty well. One of the bigger questions overall is just overall seating comfort and seat design. And that's a really hard one because different body types are going to stress a seat in different positions. From being a kind of a bony person, the only complaint I have here is the bottom cushion seems a little flat for my butt. I noticed that it did get sore after about 2 hours of driving. Now, in terms of bolstering and everything, it's held me in place extremely well for a leather seat, and that's even driving like a total animal. When I looked at the exterior of this vehicle, I thought to myself, well, it hides its dimensions pretty well for a mid-sized car. So I thought, well, there's got to be a trade-off of that. So I moved this front seat more towards the rear and got in the back seat. And I was surprised at how much legroom was back there. It's actually a comfortable space. And then you have that rear shade that goes down on both passenger and driver side in the rear, which is a really nice touch to have that built in. The next thing is ergonomics, specifically this steering wheel. Let me tell you, this is one of the best steering wheels I've encountered in any mainstream car. There's a couple reasons why, let me tell you. First off, this flat bottom. You kind of take it for granted, but the truth is when you're changing your hands in a steering maneuver, it gives you a lot more leverage. The second thing is the choice of materials. The leather choice with perforation where your hands are always resting, and then the smooth, like glove-like leather on the top and the bottom of the wheel. It just feels really high quality for the price point of this car. The next thing is the button layout. It is so simple. You can always figure out where you're going for volume, for mode selection, for menu selection. It's just about as good as you can get without cluttering the wheel with a ton of stuff. Moving on to the rest of the ergonomics, this center stack specifically. Now I just got out of the Kia Sorento and I kind of knocked the infotainment there because it looked like this cheap Chinese head unit knockoff that you would get. This does not have that problem because they've moved all the physical buttons down here into a logical, easy to read place. There's no gimmicks, there's no capacitive touch or touch sensitive controls. It's all physical buttons, easily laid out and easily readable. My only knock, just like the Sorento, is your HVAC control knobs. You can't tell what the temperature is without looking at the screen. Now again, if your screen goes bad or you have a failure with that down the road when you're out of warranty, you won't know what your temperature is. The rest of the cabin is along the same lines. There's not a lot to complain about here because they've done so many things so well. This whole center area for storage, I can put my phone there. There's actually a place for usable storage for modern devices. You have two pretty well-designed cup holders. You have a huge center storage area here that also powers, you have 280-watt, 12-volt chargers, USB charger, an aux connector. In the glove box, you have another power adapter. Overall, the storage space is excellent in here and well thought out. Now, in terms of infotainment, this is kind of a big deal for most people, or it can be a source of a big annoyance. The reality is this screen quality is really good. This is a major step up. It's very clear, it's bright in the daylight. I like that a lot. In terms of overall menu navigation, it's still clumsy. You have to do everything on the touch screen. There are physical controls for jumping to your, like your radio, media, phone. That makes it easier. But when you get into like the setup menu to change things, the touch scrolling's pretty slow. When you bring up your map screen, you don't have pinch to zoom capability here. You just kind of one finger scroll around. It works, but again, it's not going to blow you away. Now this does have Android Auto, and kind of the gimmick with Android Auto is not only do you have to have the software downloaded on your phone and all the apps up to date in the latest version of Android, you actually have to plug your phone in with a cable. Now it's cool because you get Google Maps on your screen and you can do some generic voice searches, which is nice. Define flatulence.
Flatulence, the accumulation of gas in the alimentary canal.
Oh, would you look at that? The sun came out for this final part. And at this point, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, this guy's usually a big complainer. He must have a head injury, or maybe he's in a really good mood. Well, let me tell you, I'm actually in a really bad mood today, and I can't find too much to complain about in here. Yes, I don't like the fact that the infotainment relies too much on touch. There's no central controller. I'm not a big fan of the plastics in here, including the plastic around the infotainment screen. But overall, these are just cheesy complaints compared to the big picture in here. And the reality is, this is one of the better mainstream cars I've ever been in. This is one of my top choices overall.